Hello friends, welcome to my channel. In this video we will look into the lifecycle methods of Blazor application and we'll try to understand how and when they are invoked and what exactly they do. We will also look into the diagram and try to understand the invocation of these methods. Okay, so here are the list of methods which are termed as the lifecycle methods. The first one is the set parameter async. Now this is the first method that is executed when the component is created. Now this method, it sets the parameter that are provided by the parent component. Now this method, it have a parameter called parameter view. Now this parameter view contains all the value for every property that is marked with the attribute called parameter or cascading parameter in the component. The next two methods which are called after set parameter async is the onInitialized or onInitialize async. Now as the name suggests, these methods are invoked when the component is being initialized. Now these methods are invoked when the parent component has passed the initial values to the receiving component. Okay. Now this method can be used to call any data services which are required by the component. And if the requirement is to refresh the UI after the data is populated, then the asynchronous version is the method where we can do so. Okay. Now next one is on parameter set and on parameter set async. Now these methods are called when the component has received the parameter from its parent component and these values are assigned to its properties. Now these methods are also invoked whenever the parent component re-renders or any parameter are updated or a new parameter is added to the component. The next two methods is the on after render and on after render async. Now this method are called after the component has finished rendering. Now at this point all the element and the component references are populated. Okay. Now if the user want to perform any additional initialization of the component, like for example if you want to attach an event to an event listener, or if you want to initialize a JavaScript library, then these kind of activities can be done in this method. Okay. Now this method also has a parameter called first render, and it is set to true only for the first time when the component instance is rendered. Okay. And this can be used to avoid additional initialization of the component, and we can make sure that the initialization of the component is done only once. Okay. So next one is the should render method, and this method is invoked right before the component is re-rendered, and if the user wants, he can stop the current or future rendering of the component just by returning false from this method. Okay. Now as we can see, all the methods here except for set parameter and should render are having synchronous and asynchronous version of them. We need to understand that the asynchronous version is always invoked after the synchronous version has completed its execution. Okay. Now the next one is the state has changed. Now this method is not the part of method lifecycle, but user can invoke this method in order to refresh the user interface, just in case if he has updated any of the properties of the component. Okay. Now another one is dispose method. If the component has implemented the iDisposable pattern, then this method will be called whenever the component goes out of the scope. Okay. Now let's look into the diagram, and one thing to note that here in this diagram, that whenever any of the parameter is updated from its parent component or the parent component is re-rendered, the on parameter set and on parameter set async is called, and as soon as it is called, the on after render and on after render is also executed. just in case if any of the state has also changed in the component, these two methods are always called. Okay, now let's look into the code and see the workflow of this methods. Okay, so here in Visual Studio I have created a Blazor server application and I have added a new component called display date. Now this display date can accept a parameter called current date time, which is of type string, as well as I have added a button so that on click of it we update this current date time, and only the date part is being taken from the date time. And inside index.razor component I have called this component so that it can act as a child, as well as I am passing current date time from this component. Okay, so in order to do that I have added a button. So once we click this button, we are again getting the date time and setting this value so that this value will get updated on the child component, which in turn will show us the sequence of lifecycle methods. As well as I have added all the lifecycle method in both of this component so that we can see how and when they are called. Okay, so let's execute the application and see the method invocations in both of these components. Okay, now this is the child component and this is the whole razor component. Now this child component is hosted inside this index.razor component, and once we executed that, we can see that all the lifecycle methods are being called. The first one is the set parameter async. After that, on initialize is called, followed by on initialize async, and on after render, which is having a parameter of first render whose current value is true, and followed by on parameter set async. And once this method is called, on after render and on after render async is always called once these methods are invoked. And here we can see that the value this time for first render parameter is false. Similarly, the same method sequence is called for the child component as well. Okay, now what we are going to do is we are going to click this button, which will create the date time value and pass it to the child component, which will get updated here and here in both the places. And once we pass this method to the child component, few of the lifecycle method will get invoked and we'll see what are these. Okay, so I'll click on this button. Okay, now we can see the date time is updated on both the components, and after that we see that on after render is called, followed by on after render async, and after that a set parameter which is called by the parent component, and after that on parameter set, followed by on parameter async, and for again this method is always followed by on after render and on after render async. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on set my own date button. So this will update only the date part, not the time, and we are currently on sequence number 15, and we'll see what methods are invoked once the component itself update any of its properties. Okay, so I'll click on this button, and just to show again, we are on event number 15. So I'll click on this button, so the date part is updated. And once we come down and see that on after render and on after render async is the only method which is being invoked once the component updates its parameter. Okay, well, I hope you understand the differences and the method invocation. Well, that's it from the video. I hope this video is helpful to you. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.